Hello and welcome to another episode of Food Truths. I'm your host, Eric Scholze, and today I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Charlotte Biltekoff, Professor of American Studies in Food Science and Technology, and the Darrell Cordy Endowed Professor at Food, Wine, and Culture at the University of California, Davis. What a mouthful. She builds bridges between scientific and cultural approaches to questions about food and health, and her expertise, which I find interesting and the reason we're having her on the show today, is on understanding where ideas about, quote, good and bad food come from and the social and cultural role they play. Her latest book is called Real Food, Real Facts, Processed Food, and the Politics of Knowledge. It's about how good food became, quote, real in the beginning of the 21st century and how the food industry has responded to increasingly negative public views of processed food with science-based education and information campaigns designed to correct what they see as public misperceptions. Dr. Biltekoff, thank you so much for being on Food Truths today.
Thank you, Eric. I'm really happy to be here, and please call me Charlotte.
Well, just for folks listening. So Charlotte has come on the show, and we're doing this series, and this is the second in the series on sort of what the heck is ultra-processed food, what is it not? Now, the previous guest on the show took a decidedly scientific approach, or I should say like a very science empirical, very sort of logistical fact. But part of the reason I wanted to talk with you is because you approach it from a slightly different angle. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about how you ended up, of course, on the topic of processed food and written books about it, but in general, the role of culture in how we perceive food's value, whether it be healthy, good, bad, or in between.
Yeah, I mean, I think that much of our conversations about good and bad food has been oriented around scientific questions and answers to those questions. But I think we all intuitively know and experience food to be so much more than that, and our perceptions and experiences of good and bad food to be truly layered with all kinds of social meaning. And that comes from historical processes that change over time, that inform sort of patterns in how we think about good and bad food, as well as our own personal histories and individual experiences, cultural and familial. All of that comes together around our experiences of good and bad food. And I guess I would say I came to these questions in part because, well, for one, when I was young, like a kid, I felt like there was so much going on about food beyond what was being beyond what were people were like easily recognizing and talking about. Like, I was fascinated by marketing for food. I was fascinated by new food products. I felt like there was a story there that was wanting to be told. That wasn't just about the food and the package and what was in it, but that was about, like, where did this come from? Why this? Why now? Why is this what our food looks like and tastes like? And why is all this taken to be normal and natural when clearly it comes from somewhere and has a history? And I when I got to college, I thought, this is what I want to learn about. This is what I'm going to study. But the reality was that that wasn't something you could study in college in the 1990s. So I was pretty frustrated by that, and I actually ended up dropping out of college and moving to San Francisco and becoming a cook. And so I got to have this really different relationship with food, like, very, very tactile, very intense, really relating to food, as a material, as work and as pleasure and play and creativity and all of that. But I still had these persistent questions about, how do we get here? What's happening behind the scenes? What is really going on here is kind of like the persistent set of questions that I had. And I had this amazing experience where I discovered a book of food history that really blew my mind. And it blew my mind in two ways that I think are really important. One, it said, look, food history is something that can be written, that's important, that can teach us a lot of really important things about ourselves, our history, our identity, our character, etc. And two, that story was so fascinating. The book was called Perfection Salad. It was about a group of dietary reformers at the turn of the at the turn of the 20th century. Sorry, 19th to the 20th century, who were really invested in changing other people's diets. And they believed that some of the most pressing social problems facing them at the time could be addressed by teaching people how to eat right, how to be good eaters, how to have better diets. And they had this whole social movement around this. And I was working in a vegetarian restaurant in San Francisco in the 1990s. And I don't know if that rings any bells for you, but it was a moment when Alice Waters and others were starting their own social movement around trying to teach other people how to eat right. So, on the one hand, I was reading about this, movement that was led by a woman reformer, Ellen Richards, 100 years ago. And on the other hand, I was seeing a social movement happening around me. And Alice Waters was saying the same thing as Richards. She was saying, we can improve people's characters. We can address some of the most pressing social problems facing us at this moment by teaching people how to eat right. Okay. But the thing that was totally wild about this is that they had entirely different ideas about what a good diet was. Not just different, but opposite, like completely contradictory. Ellen Richards had an idea about and bringing science and industry into the kitchen, really. And Alice Waters had an idea about banishing science and industry from the kitchen, getting back to history and culture and cuisine and tradition and intuition and the senses and getting your hands dirty, all that. So totally opposite. So this was the moment for me where I was like, wow, okay. So we have a history of dietary ideals and dietary advice. That ideas about diet change over time, but what is it about changing people's eating style, eating habits, or improving people's diets that transcends the dietary advice itself? Because they had the same ideas about the power of teaching people to eat right, even though what they were trying to teach people was so different. And this was such a hook for me because it just really pointed to this whole world of social meaning behind the dietary advice itself. And that is what I've continued to pay attention to. So the first book really was about that. Eating Right in America is the name of the book. It was really about the relationship between dietary ideals and social ideals, what it means to eat right, and how that's changed over time. But now, since I finished that book in like 2013, 14, the world changed around me and the conversation really became about processed food. And I found it to be complicated and confusing, kind of a mess that I really wanted to understand. And so I sort of took that lens of like, well, there's always more going on, than it seems on the surface. There's always a bigger history about social concerns and morality and a history of where ideas and good and bad foods come from that's there to be understood. And so that's why I really dove in specifically to this set of questions and concerns.
So why? First off, I have to say I have my own Alice Waters as a fellow Bay Area person. At one point, when we were doing cultivated meat at Upside Foods and bringing that on, we really wanted to bring her on board, and she was so anti any version of food, even if it was more
Yes.
sustainable, if it had fundamentally science in it. We'd got nowhere with her. Um,
Yes.
Alice, if you're listening, come on the show. I'd love to talk to you about this. But I wanted to use that as a. Why do you think those two viewpoints that you were mentioning the sort of more science in food approach, maybe using it to help people versus the Alice Waters sort of like traditionalism. Like, why do you think those, like, what motivated those two approaches? Like, they seem opposites almost. Maybe they're not, but I'm curious sort of why they keep popping or why they've popped out or faded in and out of existence or popularity.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, in the early years of the dietary reform movement that I was referring to earlier was eventually became called the domestic science movement and later evolved into home economics. So we all know something about this history. It's just that the early years in which it was a social movement, um, really powered by women who were part of the progressive era and trying to make larger social changes, not just teaching women how to sew and cook, um, tends to get lost. And there was a lot going on at that time in terms of concerns about social turmoil. This all is going to sound familiar because here we are again. Concerns about social turmoil, about changes in the social fabric, about everybody streaming into the cities and coming in contact with new kinds of people. The whole social order is kind of disrupted and out of equilibrium, and there's concerns about the way that people's lives and livelihoods and lifestyles and health is being affected by living in cities and living in close proximity and working in factories and all of that. And so these women who became domestic scientists both wanted to address those social problems and wanted to position themselves as part of the solution in terms of science and industry. And so there was an idea that, like, at that time, right, what it meant to bring science into the kitchen was about like order and precision, and about being driven, by these new sort of positive modern forces, science and technology, and you know deliberate, data driven kind of how you would even move from from the sink to the refrigerator kind of thing. Um, and at the same time, I think, while that sort of stream has a very long history, so does the one that says we need to stay closer to nature. The answer is in nature or in the past. And I think that in the middle part of the century and around World War II, there becomes a real sort of investment in science and technology. And then coming out of World War II, there's such a boom in industry around food, and new investment in chemicals and processes and technologies that bring us the mass distribution, modern industrialized food system that we all take to be completely normal at this point. Um, but there comes a time, like, there's a strand throughout all of that, of course, that's questioning it and thinking we need to stay closer to nature, and look to the past instead of moving so quickly into this industrialized future. But I think there's a lot of sort of factors that come together at the end of the 20th century and headed into the 21st century that bring us, Alice Waters, for example, but also bring us lots of other sort of social formations, social movements, ways of thinking, redefinitions of food and health and good food, that all kind of converged at the early part of the 21st century to really raise questions about whether processed food is good for us, to really start to redefine good food around this conception of real. And certainly Alice Waters' notion about good food being real is part of that, and that comes from an ecological and environmental perspective, as well as one that's about pleasure, and enjoyment, and that kind of thing. But I can talk. Maybe it's useful at this point to talk a little bit about, like, all of those forces that come together in the early 21st century, um, at this sort of converging around this. Would you like to go there? Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a little thread I want to pull on because we're going to get to. I really want to hear on the road for the listeners here. The road to processing, I think, has to go through the word real, and we're going to get there. And also, I want to unpack just a question: why do we keep rediscovering the appeal to nature fallacy in food? Versus, and I know you talk about this in your books, food to scientism, which you're going to explain a little bit more too. I don't see those as necessarily oppositional forces, but I'm genuinely interested where you have come across this in the research of why we keep going to this naturalistic fallacy in food. Is there a reason for that you've uncovered?
Um, hmm. Well, I mean, I think it's reasonable, even if inaccurate, as an expression of it is often served as an expression of a desire for distance from industry, from capitalism, from the larger systems and structures
Mm.
that tend to exercise their power in ways that people don't always like in our culture and society. So I think it's really useful. Okay, so the naturalistic fallacy is one way to think about it. People think that things are natural are better and safer, and they're not. They're wrong about that, right? So that's the construct that the
And
naturalist,
that's the
right?
angle. Yeah, yeah. I'm not saying
Yeah,
that's applies to every aspect of nature,
right.
but for food, it's something we constantly come across in this
Yes,
food,
it
especially as a
is.
food scientist.
Right.
That effectively you're doing the opposite of what's good by not embracing nature. quote unquote,
Yeah. No, and
to distill it. But I would love to hear more about, like, I think it's interesting though that there's this culture aspect, that there's more to it than that, and I'd love to hear that.
yes, certainly. And I understand that from coming from a food science perspective, it really does bother people that, that the perception that natural is healthier, safer, better for us is irritating from a food science perspective. Um, One of the things that I thought was really interesting that I came across when I was doing research for Real Food, Real Facts is that I actually spent a long time immersing myself in the thousands, over 7,000 comments that the FDA received in response to its request for public comments about whether or not they should regulate the term natural for human food. So using, support from computational methods, I was able to analyze all of those comments. And one of the things, so there were a lot of comments that came from industry groups, trade associations, manufacturers, and other organizations representing the food industry. And there were a lot of comments that came from individual members of the public who were expressing their point of view about this. Now, that is where you saw a lot of people saying, natural should mean the obvious. It should mean that it was never touched. Should mean that the apple fell from the tree and there were no scientists involved and no lab and no lab coats and no chemicals and nothing synthetic. And, this kind of common sense. There was actually hundreds of people who cited various dictionary definitions of natural, saying this is how natural should be defined. It's so obvious. Why are we even having this conversation? That was like a very prevalent sentiment. Like, it's an insult to us that you're even asking this question. Clearly this is nefarious because we all know what natural means, and we just want our food to be safe and natural. So, um and so certainly one way to look at that is that the public is misunderstanding what nature means in when it comes to food, and you could certainly apply the naturalistic fallacy as a way of understanding that. But what I came to see was something actually very different from that. So nature and natural are such powerful terms and concepts. So one way that people can use the idea or concept or language of nature or natural is to kind of say, like, it's common sense. We all know this. No expertise is needed here, right? Like, once you claim that something is natural or close to nature, you're really establishing a kind of authority that says, this is true, this is real, this is right, and I know it, and don't we all know it, it's a way of exercising authority that I started to understand as like a counterbalance, a counter pressure, a counter movement to the kind of power that the industry and its representatives in these major trade associations who were weighing in on the question were using in their appeals to science-based reason, and to the idea that they had science on their side and they were going to determine what the FDA should do based on scientific reason, right? And so, in a way, I started to see these both as um, ideological kind of constructs, both of which claim a lot of authority, and what is sometimes in the literature called like a discursive stopper, like a way of just shutting down further debate by saying, I'm right, we all know it, scientific authority on the one hand and appeals to nature and what's natural on the other, also very powerful. Both
Mhm.
of these terms um, also really circulate very freely in our language and in our culture. They're very flexible. They're used in lots of different ways, and they are often used. Authority tends to go with them, and so I thought that was just like another way of thinking about it that was quite useful in terms of understanding what was going on in those comments, but also more broadly.
Fun fact: when I
Hmm.
was at FDA and I was on novel foods at the time, you have to have a subject matter expert review public comments, and I worked on many issues like not natural, but I that somebody had to review them, every single one,
Oh
and you had to
wow.
document it. And I was charged with figuring out how many comments on average, was there any algorithmic efficiency to the number of comments that would come in that would be both substantive and responsive, which was the key delineator of whether your comment would be taken seriously by the US government. They had to be both. And I found out that it was pretty constant. No matter what you were asked on or how many comments came through, it was 0.25% of all comments were both substantive and responsive to the request. Um, and it's so interesting because I had to review a lot of comments like this too, and I found it fascinating to learn what most people would say. For example, I'm sure there was a modal comment, and it might have been the dictionary definition. I'm curious what it was actually for natural. I forget. But then there's these minority of comments that are the ones that end up informing policy at the government. And I'm curious if you came across those because ultimately the government has to release something about that. But was there like a common sentiment that you saw in these? And then was there sort of like when people wrote their dissertations and submitted to U.S. government, was there a different thread that you saw, if anything?
Oh boy, yes. I mean, so the other piece of this sort of public sentiment was largely around, it's common sense, nothing from a lab, no white coats, no scientists. Um, and there was another piece that was also very prevalent, which was anger and frustration. You know, a sense that the FDA had let us down, that the food industry and the government were colluding, um, there was, too much of a revolving door. There was a sense of frustration about power and power dynamics. And I think that's really oftentimes, so there's a long history of natural food movements
Mhm.
and questioning expertise and established ways of knowing have always been part of those natural food movements. And this is no different. And so, part of what people in the docket, individuals who wrote in expressing this idea that it's so obvious what natural is and it involves get scientists out of my food, um, were they were expressing this sort of sense of frustration about the fact that as consumers, they felt their voices weren't being heard, their priorities weren't being considered, their health wasn't being protected by those whose job it was to protect them. And this docket became an opportunity to express that outrage and frustration. I'm guessing you've seen that in other ones. I'm guessing we're going to
Yeah.
see it in the UPF one
Yeah.
that's open right now. I noticed it's only received about 80 something comments. I think that's probably because the big guns are carefully crafting their
Hmm.
responses. One of
Hmm.
the ways that the docket really sorts itself, and you know this very well, is
Hmm.
that individual members of the public will write their comments right into the portal. And then the trade associations and corporate actors will submit attachments on letterhead. And so they actually end up looking very different and sort of easily sortable. Um, and did you want to ask a question about that?
No, I
Maybe.
was going to say like we always knew the most quote unquote most important like comments often came in the last 48 hours from whoever,
Yeah.
individuals, corporations,
Oh,
trades, all that stuff. We knew the bulk of the reading was going to have to be from those 48 hours. Um,
yeah. So and then I would say you asked about what kind of themes were emerging, and I told you about the themes from the public,
mhm,
right? And all of this I think is actually really relevant to what is potentially going to come into the UPF
mhm,
docket. But what I noticed in terms of the experts, the corporate actors and trade associations who also submitted their comments, but as attachments on letterhead, is they almost, I mean, there are some who were who were much more aligned with the public, right? Because it was more aligned with the interests of their industries. For example, the organic industries were very much aligned in sentiment, and we can talk about that more. But just want to sideline that in a second to get to really answer your question. Um, so there were there was a very the common refrain was the FDA needs to regulate based on science, science-based reason, science-based reason, science-based reason. That's the major theme that's coming from the experts and in the attachments. Once you get any more granular than that, you can see almost every conceivable notion of what natural should be claimed as based in science. Science-based reason says pistachios that are flavored should be considered natural because X. Science says irradiation should be considered natural because Y. Science says GMO should be considered natural. Science says uh, chlorine in the chillers for turkeys should be considered natural because, like, every conceivable, so what I think is important here is not that science is contradictory, and I mean that's obvious. These were contradictory notions. They were incommensurate. It was not possible to adopt any one of them and not be in trouble with the others. But what I think is important here is that science can tell us a lot of things about how food is changed in processing and, you know, degrees of difference from its natural state and all of that kind of thing. But it cannot answer the question of how policy should be written, what something should mean, um, how that meaning will function in as a in the intersection between the public and industry and regulators, right? The term has to mean something and function at that intersection. That's a complex thing to try to do. And there's a lot of meaning there, and there's a lot of policy there, and science has a role. But when these actors are evoking science as having the answer to the question, they're really far exceeding what science can contribute to the conversation. And not at all to say that what science can contribute isn't important. It absolutely is. But I think that some of the tension in the docket and some of the tension that we're living with now comes from that kind of like claiming the authority to make these kind of policy decisions and to wait to really determine what something should mean, which is such a complex cultural. You're dealing with perception, you're dealing with expectation, especially when it came to natural, because the FDA's definition hinged on perception and expectation of the public, right? That there's nothing in the food that the consumer wouldn't expect to be in there was the long-standing policy that was potentially going to be changed by that rulemaking. Um, so anyhow, I think that there's a lot of tension that you see in a docket like that. We're going to see, I think, something very similar in the UPF docket.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that this is the talisman of for UPFs and defining them. I think it's natural version 2.0. I think you're very
Mhm.
correct about this in terms of how we're going to define it. And you bring up an interesting point as someone who did made policy, and of course, as an ardent scientist. I mean, and I have a my view of science very much aligns with David Deutsch, the sort of Oxford physicist, who says, we're always in search of good explanations. And of course, he defines what a good explanation is. It's very hard to change without, the facts can change around it, but it itself is very explanatory. Um, and so I think that like there's a we just science is often trying to understand more and more about it, obviously explaining the world, but also and then policy is it's the oil and water. They're immiscible liquids that you're forcing together, often the cultural and societal aspect, and you're trying to force that into empiricism, and they don't always mix. And but where they do mix, where you make a little bit of mayonnaise, so to speak, that's policy. um, and I tell people making policy is incredibly hard because it's a game of compromises, trade-offs. You're gonna always piss somebody off with your choices. So how do you make the best choices? And I feel like we're always doing that without complete information, candidly. You're always having to go, I wish we knew more so we could make a better decision, but we don't. So I think this is where maybe FDA, I don't want to speak for them, they lean more on the science based decision making because at the end of the day, if they have to hedge, they're going to hedge towards science um, because they feel like that's something they can defend. I don't know. But I'm curious with that in mind, and you kind of this concept of food scientism that you sort of, and again forgive me for if I bastardize your decision, this idea that removing ignorance and providing factual bases is sort of the one true way of knowing, so to speak, but you don't necessarily agree. The better question in the context of ultra processed foods might be exploring the term, concept, and classification as sort of a cultural object. Like, what are UPFs in that sense, and where does this concept come from? And I'm sure that gets us to where the real food comes from, how good food becomes real, as well.
Mhm.
But let me step back. I'm curious, to get your reaction in one, how you would, feel free to take any aspect of that question.
Yeah, let's start with you brought in the term of food scientism. So this is a concept that I think is really useful that I use in the book to talk about a set of assumptions. So scientism is it refers to assumptions about the primacy of scientific ways of knowing, and it refers also to the phenomenon of sort of narrowing the terrain of allowable discourse or reasonable discourse to questions that can be answered by science and the effects of that. Once the assumption has been made that science is the one or primary or most important way of knowing about something, about the world in general, then we end up with sort of a narrow view of the problems because that view is designed so that science can answer, address the issues. It's a kind of narrowing that has some interesting side effects. One of them is that anything outside of that sort of terrain of what can be addressed by science or known through science sort of gets removed from the picture. And um, the when people sort of try to engage with those issues, they tend to be considered irrational or misinformed. So a lot of times when people are being deemed, the public's being deemed irrational or misinformed or lacking in scientific literacy, it's because they're responding to the complexity of the problem, including all of its social and cultural aspects. And certainly the food system is profoundly, complex and comprised of all kinds of, social, political, economic, et cetera, kind of interconnections. And so the food scientism sort of suggests that despite that, we should be able to sort of ask and answer questions through a scientific lens. The other, so it produces this idea that food scientism actually produces the idea of public misinformation, or what we think of as deficits. Public knowledge deficits is a side effect or a consequence of the idea that science is the primary and only way of knowing about food in this case, or about the food system. um, Another thing that sort of oftentimes the public is reacting to the values, the implicit assumptions, values, purposes, and aims that are baked into or built into expert decision making about the development of science or the development of technologies, the deployment and use of technologies. So, for example, certain kind of assumptions about like the direction that the food system is heading, what's important, who gets to be part of the conversations, all of that is reflected in policies and priorities that claim to be purely scientific. Is that making sense? Do you want to ask any questions that can help me clarify that?
Yeah, there's one I would love if you are there like things you see, maybe sort of somewhat concrete examples or the conceptual of like the limits that you can encounter in science versus scientism versus other ways of knowing that play into food decision making, or maybe as are related to ultra processed. I'm curious where you see sort of the limits of these systems.
There's so many ways to come at that. I mean, one of them we've already discussed, right? Which is that
Hmm.
when it comes to defining natural, there's those are questions of meaning and policy, right? And so
Hmm.
when you presume to be or when you claim when an expert claims to be simply deploying science, but in the name of making an argument about what natural should mean that's completely aligned with what that particular industry interest group wants the outcome to be for business purposes, um, that's a kind of misinformation. That's very confusing and frustrating to the public, right? And so there's I think that it's really become a commonplace for experts to see the public as or to be concerned that the public is anti-science when it comes to food. You know, I've been seeing this for a long time. We're talking about it a lot now for obvious reasons.
Mhm.
But I've seen this, you know, I've been tracking this very closely since 2014. And this has been a preoccupation and a concern among industry experts, you know, since negative perceptions about processed food became widely conceived to be a danger to the food, and like a threat to the food industry and to its business. And what I really, as a, what I think can be helpful as a tool is to think about ways in which the public is actually anti food scientism, not anti science. That means that the public is reacting to ways in which experts are claiming scientific authority in spaces where it doesn't actually belong because it's not the right kind of expertise for the job. So let's say the question is, um, about, I know you work in the cultivated meat space, right? And so there's a lot of really important scientific questions there. How do we scaffold? How do we make it safe? How do we make it scalable and afford? You know what all those are. Should we do it? Is it the right answer to the question of what kind of food system do we want to live in the future? That is not a question that science can answer. Who's asking and answering that question? Who's creating the space for that larger problematic to emerge and to be handled through disagreement, productive disagreement and debate? That's one of those edges. We could probably spend the rest of our time together just talking about different edges.
Yeah.
They're everywhere, you know? They're
Well, I think
everywhere.
it's super helpful. And I, in the cultivated space, I think the most hands-off approach. I know it's not ideal because of what, but we always just say like it isn't rational. The consumer will decide whether this is the right decision or not, like whether these products get picked up or whatever. But we're also seeing Italy banning these products. Another state has joined in the bans. So who knows? I don't. You're right. I think if science just makes all the policy, that I think that's the definition of technocracy, right? Like that's a technocratic state. And I don't know that anyone has successfully done that. And I'm not necessarily advocating for that. But I'm curious then if we could jump straight into, with that context into UPFs.
Mhm,
Where are, maybe a question is sort of philosophically, where are you looking at this issue?
mhm.
Because I've been asking everyone, one, how they define it, and if you'd like to attempt to, feel free to do so. But I'm really curious from your perspective, just like, how are you looking at this as a cultural phenomenon, as a society, as a policy issue, as a health, like, how are you seeing this?
Yeah.
And what's interesting to you right now?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the things that I want to bring to the conversation that I think is important is that to me, UPFs, or the ultra processed food designation, the NOVA classification that it comes from, is um, a challenge to um, establish ways of knowing about food. So I think that it's really important that we develop the tools, the language, the vocabulary, and the propensity to have the conversations about expertise and about authority, that are, because all of that, like all of this sort of churn, about how good food should be defined and how we should understand it, and ultra processed food and all of that is so much informed by what I call knowledge politics, contests over different kinds of expertise, contests over the what kind of questions about the food system matter and how we should answer them. So I see UPFs as a part of a larger, sort of cultural, um, movement that has been going on since the early 21st century, that I call the real food frame, that converges a bunch of what I see as legitimate concerns about the food system converge around, and we can talk about what those are, converge around the idea that good food is real and processed food should be avoided. That's important, and we should talk about the history of that. But I want to say that that's not the whole story. A lot of what's also happening through that redefinition about good food is all kinds of challenges to established authority, particularly nutritional ways of thinking about food. This relation, this focus on nutrients and the relationship to biochemical responses in the body, to biomarkers, to specific health outcomes. Um, Nutrition had been the dominant framework for thinking about good food since the early 20th century. The founding of the modern science of nutrition takes place and sort of takes hold in the US around 1894 into the early 1900s. And since then, nutritional ways of knowing, had really became quite dominant. Now, at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, there's concerns about obesity, concerns about environment, concerns about technological risk, regulatory laxity. All of these push against established ways of knowing. One way that I like to think about this is that this actually draws on Joan Daigousso's work. She's oftentimes referred to as the mother of the local food movement, but she was a nutrition educator, and activist, and she talked about moving from microscopes to macroscopes, and that's the big change that happens at the end of the 20th century, that brings us the real food frame and these sort of ideas about good food that NOVA and UPF designation becomes part of. Um, so that idea was like, we need to stop looking through our microscopes about the relationship between specific nutrients and specific bodily responses to specific nutrients, and broaden the aperture, so that we're bringing in not just nutrients but foods, not just foods but diets, not just foods, diets, and nutrients, but farmers and land and livelihoods and animals and laborers in the food system, the whole bigger picture, and certainly sustainability and the environment, and all of that becomes part of this, like, macroscopes, thinking about good food through a totally different lens than nutrition. So at the same time, there's like a lot of this sentiment about that challenges established ways of knowing, established forms of expertise, also raises questions about the food industry's sort of reliance on that particular kind of expertise of nutrition. For example, Georgi Skrinis comes up with this idea, or this concept of nutritionism. Have you heard that language used before? So nutritionism is a reframe of nutrition that thinks about nutrition, not just as a science, but also as an ideology. This sort of prevalent idea that the way to know about good food is through the lens of nutrition. But all of these cultural changes really come knocking at the door of nutrition, really start to, like, destabilize it. And the Nova classification systems, Montero's work in Brazil and his group, they introduce something new into the morass, or the sort of mess of, like, there's something vaguely wrong about processed food, and we are getting advice from every direction, from the environmental folks and the public health people concerned about obesity, and the environmental working group people concerned about pesticides. They're all telling us eat less processed food. That becomes sort of normative. um, but we don't really know what's the difference between processed food and unprocessed food. There's no clear definition. It's quite murky. And Montero and his group step in and start to try to define that. But they are coming from what I would call a macroscopic perspective. They are coming from a public health perspective. They are looking way beyond nutrients, and they're exploding the paradigm yet again, and sort of pushing the whole conversation to include a lot of things about food that cannot be accounted for through the lens of nutrition. And that's really significant. So when I think about what UPFs are, I think about the NOVA classification. I understand what that definition is. But I also think about it as a kind of knowledge politics, a kind of contest over over which form of expertise matters when it comes to food and health.
I agree that the Nova system is inadequate, and Richard Black, who was on the last episode, also agreed and even introduced. He considered a super ultra. He introduced, based on their research, that there's a whole other realm that we're not considering, of combining ultra processed foods into one new food, a super ultra. Um, but I think he would also agree that even his system, as good as it is, still doesn't encompass what a UPF is, precisely because of what you're bringing up. I think in part there's a an aspect of this that I think is, I would describe it as inherently cultural, that we can't yet agree upon, but I don't know if it's whether because we don't yet have the terminology, we don't yet have the experience, or again, I don't know, I don't study this, but I feel like there's an aspect of this that should be cultural in the definition, something the way it's used conventionally or something like that, that's missing. We can describe it using all the reductionist techniques currently, the nutrition components, its digestibility, its it's the way the particle sizes and whatever, the degree of like refinement that goes in. But there's still some part of it that's like, well, you can always find an exception in a quote unquote healthy food, maybe those ingredients. So I still don't think we're there, and I wonder what what else do we need to know, in your opinion, or experience, or to listen to people, groups, what have you, that would allow us to complete quote unquote the definition?
Mm. Well, I I actually think that the way that the NOVA classification was written and the way that NOVA for the ultra processed food designation itself was is described, it does include a lot of social and cultural components. I think a lot of the tug of war around the concept is some folks trying to say it's nonsense and it makes no sense because it says things about packaging and marketing, right? How can that possibly, nutrition never did that before. Nutrition was about, a chemical composition that could be completely established, through laboratory science. And the whole truth of nutrition exists in the food itself and in the body. Now, Nova comes in and they say that's not going to work. We have to look at the whole system. So I actually think it's really powerful. I'm looking over here at the 2015 version of the Nova explanation, and they talk about that Nova is that the classification is meaningful, like ultra processed foods, part of the issue is what they displace. That's fully outside, right, of the food
Mm,
itself. It's about what it does, like how people use
mm,
it. It displaces healthier food. They talk about their convenience. The fact that they're imperishable and ready to consume matters. Again, those aren't nutritional concepts. That has to do with our food system, and that has to do with culture, and that has to do with all kinds of experiential pieces, like um, hyper palatable, I guess you could say. They're really talking there about the impacts of food being extra delicious, but they go on to talk about branding and ownership by transnational corporations, aggressive marketing that gives these food enormous market advantage over all other Nova food groups. So part of what matters is how they live in the world. Um,
mm,
they have vivid packaging, special deals with retailers to secure prime shelf space, um, campaigns using all kinds of media, including to children with vast budgets. All of this explains why ultra processed foods have been successful in displacing unprocessed or minerally processed food and freshly prepared dishes and meal or real food in most parts of the world. Um, and at the end, they say that the displacement of real food by ultra processed food is also a cause of social, cultural, economic, political, and environmental disruptions and crisis. So there is there's so much here that's not pragmatic in terms of policy. It's really difficult, right, to think about a policy that comes out of this that satisfies those who want a very concrete definition that will allow consumers to walk through the grocery store and say it's this and not that, and it's
mm.
this and I'm going to buy this and not that. I don't think this definition was designed to do that. I think that's part of the sort of the tension and the struggle that's being played out right now. It was designed as a tool for researchers to be able to look into what the health effects are of dietary patterns that overemphasize this kind of food. And now we're getting to the stage, right, of course, where it does matter very much that people be able to act on this and that they be able to distinguish between, you know, ultra processed food and non ultra processed food in the marketplace, because there's become this like investment in that categorization as meaningful. Um, so I think that I completely agree with you that ultimately there not only can we observe that there's this can't be simply a technical definition, it's impossible, but that was part of it from the beginning. That was always part of how Montero
Hmm.
and his crew were thinking about this. And I think it's a very powerful disruptive element to what's happening, because it is claiming um, in order to understand ultra processed food, we need so many different kinds of knowledge and understanding. This really points directly to like the need for the kind of social sciences, right? We need to understand economics, and we need to understand psychology, and we need to understand sociology, like all of these different, the ways that systems and structures and humans work within them are part of this picture. This is not a laboratory science anymore.
This is so fascinating, and you're right. You should definitely come back on. I want to unpack so much more of this with you. I got two more questions for you. One is a follow up, and again, forgive my ignorance. But could you argue that the organic movement was a mixture of both science? Because it's not entirely a science based policy. The organics
Correct.
program was as much a marketing issue, which USDA has a marketing authority, which FDA does not. That's part of the issue, I think. But it's a marketing order, and a somewhat cherry picked scientific. And I'm not saying that negatively. It is what it is. Do we have a model already in the form of the organics program that we could be using? And then related to that, the way you're describing not just the inputs that go into a food, which I think science sort of focuses on, but also the leverage that it provides as a product and industry sector, it seems like is also a major part of how we would define it. That it offers social leverage across many sectors.
We are
That is a
always
very
talk
hard part.
Yeah.
Oh, please, please, please.
I was just gonna say, we're always talking about power dynamics, and when we don't acknowledge that, things get very confusing. It's always there. We don't have a great language for it. But that's part of what happens when these things seem like they stop making sense and people can't talk to each other. It's because there's the power dynamics are not being acknowledged and sort of dealt with.
I think it makes sense even as a scientist. I'm like, okay, well, as someone who worked in policy, like it's always about who has leverage. Where's the leverage coming from? What compromises can you make? So, but it's interesting that needs to be rolled into potentially how we think about definitions. I had not thought of that before. But again, I go back to, do we have a model in organics? Is that too far afield, or is that a playbook that we could be using here for policy?
Wow, yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, organics was a social movement, right? Before it was anything else.
Mm-hmm.
You could say the same is true for the real food movement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you look at the UPF conversation we're having now as a logical extension of those movements, right, then you can sort of, and certainly we now have a bona fide social movement around real food that is Maha. And so, and the, the, the organic movement was a social movement that was about changes in agricultural practices, but also not just technical changes in agricultural practices. Right? They cared about size and scale and community and a kind of relationship to the natural world and care for the natural world that was an ethos. Um, the um the corporatization of that, or sort of move from social movement to policy and products, and what became known in my circles as industrial organic, right? And a new industry that sort of coalesces around some of the practices, but not the original values of the organic movement. Um, so that I guess you could see that kind of thing happening in the UPF space, but I think that one of what another piece that you're pointing to that might be important is that the as you know, the organic standards are different from other policy definitions because they're constantly being renegotiated by a panel of experts. So then the question remains who has a voice in that process, and what kind of values and aspirations priorities are being represented in the dialogue that continuously reshapes and deals with new questions as they emerge. So it might very much be the case that what you're saying is true, that it would need to be dynamic in the way that organic is, because it's some because the way that technology changes constantly causes that to be need to be reevaluated. Um, but whether or not it can be a meaningful solution to people who have concerns about the food system and are expressing them in outrage about UPFs, whether or not a policy like that can answer those concerns in a meaningful way, um, I that's a bigger question. There are many people who find the organic designation fairly meaningless. I mean, it's an agricultural, it's about agricultural practices. Like I said, it captures the technical aspects of organic agriculture without really capturing much of the ethos that powered that as a social movement. So where do we end up with UPFs around that? At first, it helps to acknowledge that there's a lot to the social movement that's not technical, right? And that's what we're doing. That's an important conversation to have, because for the policy to be meaningful, it has to capture some of that. Not easy thing to do.
No. And I wanted to end with a question around. So, in a review of your book, Real Food, Real Facts, Marion Nestle references the very famous C.P. Snow lecture around creation of two cultures in the Gulf of mutual incomprehension,
Yes.
where folks are literally speaking the same language, but with completely different understandings of what reality is. And food communication is no different, you make the case for. So, I'd love to end with your thoughts on what's the gulf between science-based concerns and value-based concerns, and how do we, or what are your suggested ways of resolving that, if say you're a food marketer or a food scientist, or people that work in, or you're making policy in this space, somebody in the government, we knew folks in the government listen to this show. Like, what would you tell these folks on how to talk
Hmm.
about this?
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about this conflict or contest between two different ways of seeing reality: the real food frame, which we've kind of been talking about, and the other way of thinking about it, which I call the real facts frame, which is sort of this science-driven perspective, or food scientism driven perspective, in which the public is seen as irrationally misinformed, afraid of things that they don't understand, and lacking scientific literacy, which leads them to be concerned about processed food, etc. So these are two, incommensurate ways of understanding the processed food problem, connected to lots of other incommensurate assumptions. Um, but I think that I think there's really been a lot of interest among folks in industry, experts, people who are more aligned with the real facts frame, in understanding the public and in understanding public perceptions. Um, I think it's important that we also try to understand experts and expert perceptions and misperceptions of the public. So that's one thing that I write about. But when it comes to dialogue, this question of like, how can experts talk to the public about questions about the future of food or food and health or ultra processed food or any of these things, I think it's like not there's there's some fundamentals about how we relate as humans to each other that are probably actually quite helpful. Like, the way that you build a good relationship and a good conversation with another person involves like a lot of listening and respect and humility, and empathy. And I think these are like basic qualities that experts need to bring to their conversations and interactions with the public around these questions about food and health. And to really, you know, we've had decades now of a lot of dismissing of public concerns about food and technology as irrational and misinformed on the part of experts. I think it's time to move past that and to take seriously public concerns about the food system, even when they're articulated through in ways that can be deemed factually inaccurate. Something like a naturalistic fallacy, right, can easily dismiss the concerns of the public as simply misguided. But looking past that to the what I think are legitimate concerns that drive people towards, wanting more regulation of things like UPFs or wanting less processed or minimally processed foods, like taking those concerns seriously, I think is would be my suggestion.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank Charlotte Biltekoff, Professor of American Studies and Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis, and the author of Real Foods, Real Facts, Processed Food and the Politics of Knowledge, as well as Eating Right in America, The Cultural Politics of Food and Health. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Eric. I could talk to you all day.